Hello and welcome to the Broken Rails 1156 New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Jon Kessler and Ajay Kurian. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Jon Kessler is an artist best known for his kinetic sculptures made with lights, motors, and found objects. He has been showing his work regularly in the US and abroad since his first exhibition at Artist Space in 1983. His newest sculptures are balancing acts that address the fragility of our planet. Bronze, brass, ceramics, stainless steel, and found porcelain figurines combine to form works which comment on ecological collapse and environmental precariousness. He is a professor of art at Columbia University, where he has taught since 1994. He plays guitar in several art bands. Ajay Kurian is an artist, educator, and writer. Kurian employs a fluid multimedia vocabulary which aims to articulate the social and environmental conditions that govern both our worldly and transcendental faiths. His work often tries to bridge the gap between the local and the cosmic. He is the founder of Eucrits, a global platform for virtual studio mentorship for artists of all backgrounds and experience. Kurian lives in Brooklyn, New York, and he holds a BA from Columbia University in visual arts and art history. Kurian has an upcoming exhibition opening at 47 Canal in New York on February 21st. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ajay, to get us started.
Thanks, Min. Thanks for the introductions. Hey, John, how you doing?
Hi.
It's funny, I feel like it was just us a second ago, and it was easy to kind of like maintain like what face I'm looking at. Now there's almost 40 others. So I'm gonna try to focus on your face. How are you feeling right now?
I feel good. I'm in California visiting my mom. It's her 94th birthday.
Happy birthday to John's mom.
Happy
Uh,
birthday.
let's see. So you have a show up right now at Magenta Plains on Canal and Bowery. How does it
Mhm.
feel to have a show up in the Lower East Side, especially a show called Petrified? Like, is that at all how you're feeling?
It's absolutely how I'm feeling. Yeah, the it feels really good to get this work out. It took several years to develop this new language, specifically around climate change and really limiting the number of materials that I was using, which is very unusual for me. I put very different restrictions on myself. When I felt the work was transitioning from the screen work that I was known for just previously. But maybe, Jay, what do you think about just like giving for those who don't even know me at all, maybe a little bit of an introduction into you know, like where I'm coming from. So uh, yes, as Min said, I emerged in 1983. That was my first show, and I really sort of came up in the generation of artists who were exploring a kind of a post-Duchampian ready like new use of the ready-made. So Jeff Koons, who took ready-mades and put them in plexiglass vitrines. Chaim Steinbach, who took ready-mades and put them on shelves. Robert Gober, who took ready-mades and remade the ready-mades. And I was transforming the ready-made. I was, working with found objects and using lights and motors to give them new narratives. And that's kind of my, birthing story and how I sort of came up. And so the work at Magenta Plains really sort of comes in some ways a kind of full circle from many of the things that I was doing when I first started showing, at least for the first 15, 20 years. And then, and we could, take that trip back. It's been a long, strange ride.
Yeah, I mean, I should say John and I have known each other since 2003. John was my teacher when I was an undergrad at Columbia. And so I got to know your work when you were kind of in that phase of working on sort of the panopticon of screens and how you were dealing with screens and the sort of culture that we were starting to move into. This was before Instagram and selfies and all of that. And John's work from that period, as we'll see in a second, is really prescient in kind of being there before it all happens. There's all the feedback loops that you see in John's work. It it sets the stage for the ways in which we think about image culture now. Um, but yeah, I think maybe we can start with the slideshow, Min, with installation images of the show.
Uh-huh. Fantastic. So yeah, so this is the show at Magenta Plains that's up till March 1st. And it's not a large space, and we decided to focus on three sort of mid-scale works. I have been able to sort of, scale up in the studio, and there's larger work there, but we decided to sort of focus on three of these pedestal in, like standalone pedestal sculptures. And it's the materials are stainless steel, polished, mirrored stainless steel, bronze that I am not casting. I think that's a very important aspect of this new work. All of the bronze that I'm using are spills or part of the delivery system of other people's work. So I have a couple of foundries that save their scraps. And so it's literally junk sculpture in some ways. And the bronze has a kind of, let's say, immediacy because it's flowing at 2000 degrees and then it freezes. So that's part of like the title Petrified. But so Chris Bull, Huma Baba, Dana Schutz, Kiki Smith, it's all like the poop from the residue of the making of their work, which the work is so much about putting the world back together. So and rebuilding. So it kind of fits into the narrative. And then there's the reliance on the found object, a lot of German porcelain figurines that, I've been using,
Min, can
ground.
we go till we get to like one of the main works?
Perfect, sure. Um, yeah, so there's Lagoon, Shimmering Cove, and the first one we showed was well, let's go to the next slide. You'll see it here. Scorched Earth 2. So there's a kind of that title especially sort of lays a ground for ravaged landscape. I mean, it's a strange format. These are landscape sculptures. So we're all super familiar with landscape painting, but there's not a lot of history of of landscape sculpture. So it's
True.
a yeah.
No,
So
I'd never thought about that. I never thought like in cataloging this work into a like in that way.
you know who said that? Ryan Johnson, my former student, was in the studio, and he said it for the first time, and I never even had thought of it. And yes, that's exactly what I'm making. Full disclosure, the cattails that, not that it's so inventive, but it's basically just a pivot and a fulcrum, and a balancing, that's taken from Calder's piece Pond. But that, in a funny way, is the only true kinetic aspect of this sculpture, of this sculpture, but also of the show at Magenta Plains. So there's no motors in the show, but there are motors in this new work. It's just that we didn't focus on that for the show.
Can you talk about the difference between like shifting from works that are in constant motion to a space in which like it's all about balance, especially when the thematics of the show feel like it's about a world that's highly imbalanced?
Yeah. So I want there to now I want there to be a sort of a real difference between something that is constantly moving, something that is shivering, something that is um, uh, feels excited, something that's like literally nervous, something that is absolutely still. I want you to just sort of emotionally hook into those differences in the work. And the work is very emotional. I mean, it's we could talk about the maybe let's go to the next slide. Maybe just like run through slowly. There's So this is the only remnant of the work that came before with my screen, like sort of what you mentioned in terms of being prescient, in terms of, um, forecasting screen culture. There are broken iPads in this new work, but no working screens. I guess I was thinking, you know, at after the apocalypse, you can't maybe charge up an iPad, but maybe you can get the fuck out of town on it, and float out.
But
But
also, I don't know if like I feel like when I see your work, it's not necessarily always about creating perfect legibility. Like there is an ecosystem to the sculpture itself where an
mm,
iPad becomes like a little rivulet or pond, and that's enough. It doesn't have to be like uh discursive in a way where it's like, ah, well, if we think about screen culture and how it's been destroyed by such and such, it's like there's maybe more nuance
thank
than
you.
having it be read so clearly.
No, thank you. And it always has been. I mean, that's always been, I've never been such a discursive artist. There's always been a lot of room, let's say, for interpretation. Is it a critique? Am I exploiting the subjects that I'm, possibly critiquing? I mean, it's been a sort of a somewhat fluid between the two. Let's go to the next slide. There's also one of the things that is very important to talk about in this work is that and this happened with the screen, with the surveillance stuff too, when I introduced a new material into my work, the work really shifted. And that was really what happened with this work when the bronze entered the work and when I started using ceramics. So not the porcelain figurines, those I've been using for 40 years, but the ceramics that I'm making. So those are I was that sort of added a haptic, organic, gestural to the work, and also another aspect of randomness and chaos, which I adore because I open up the kiln and I don't know what really I'm going to get. And I know you've been working in ceramics, and that's really it's part of its pleasure is the unknown of it.
It's a beautiful process. It's also, I mean, this is maybe the first time I've seen your work where all the materials have lifespans that are pretty expansive. Like all of
Yeah.
these materials will last for thousands and thousands of years in
Mhm.
ways that can be preserved quite easily. Whereas before, I think there are plenty of like plastic tchotchkes, plenty of things that are just styrofoam or like things that are meant to look like other things. Whereas
Mhm.
there is a almost, I use this word with suspicion, but like almost a different kind of honesty in materials with this new body of work.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I feel that too. Yeah, I mean,
How do you feel
tell
about the shift
tell
with
that tell that to the collectors, Ajay. Just no, just joking. But there is a there is an archivalness. I was mentioning this the other day at a talk at Magenta Plains. Typically, I go to my shows and I'm just like I walk in scared that the pieces are going to be broken or not working correctly. And I didn't have that with this show because it's they are much more solid and much more archival. Um,
How did you like when you were talking about the introduction of new materials such as bronze and ceramic, what did change in the studio? Like what when you think about, okay, so you started introducing motors at a very early moment and that spawned so many different things. What was that moment of spawning with these materials?
Man, maybe just like slowly just keep going through. Yeah. So I was teaching at Anderson Ranch and they have a casting facility, and over in the corner were these parts that were left over. They were sprues and portholes. And I just brought them back to my studio and I was actually working on uh, an installation about Trump. So it was around 2016, and I was working on this another immersive installation, and I kept looking at these bronze parts, and there was something about the form, the shape, and the form, and the fact that I didn't make them, but the fact that they really sort of like felt. Um, uh, they were aesthetic, they were forms in themselves, but there was also like there was something they were all cut off, because they're typically you would just remelt them and there was something I felt like I needed to save in these, and kind of like honor in those bronze parts. And that became a kind of a theme in this work, which is about resurrection and repairing and renewal and yeah, repair and yeah, reuse.
Yeah, it makes me think of like the way that in so many different cultures with food, like when times are tough, you use what you can get and you try to make it as good as possible. So it in a sense it almost feels like these are like the entrails of monuments.
I love that. And and to answer your question about like how things change in the studio, I had to learn new tricks, which is what I had to do when I had to learn, using surveillance and video. And I love that. It's like I'm 68. I love, an old dog can learn new tricks, and so using stainless steel, really like leaning into my TIG welding skills. All the stainless steel is uh, all the stainless steel is welded with bronze, and so it has a very goopy kind of. My wife calls it synagogue art. It kind of like looks a lot like the kind of things you see in Reform synagogues sometimes, and also relates to a lot of sculptors who I love, like Ibram Lassaw or uh, um, Lynn Chadwick. Um,
Picasso,
uh,
I
sorry.
mean, Picasso, there's the goat here is
That's right. So yeah, go back one min. Sorry. Yeah, that's a Picasso. That's a replica. That's another found object of a Picasso goat. And if you go to the yeah, so that's called the gate. That is cast on. Those are cast iron residue of casting, given to me by a former student who died last year, and her name is Julia Jalowiak. Well, you knew Julia. She was at Skowhegan when you taught there, and
yeah.
she saved me. She loved casting iron to do cast iron pieces, and she saved me those parts. It's a bit of a homage to her. But if you look close, you'll see inside the Picasso goat's belly a salamander. So it's kind of like hermit crab idea of just like repurposing, but also just like finding a new home after the fire. So yeah, that's the gate that was shown in the Brooklyn Museum and in the that big artist show.
It's hard to, I feel like it's hard to fully understand what you were talking about in terms of kind of that level of anxiety and that trembling that happens because there are so many points of balance within the sculptures that every now and then things are like wobbling a little bit or moving and even that implied movement gives you the sense of like you're holding your breath. And it's just something I want to keep in mind. Like when we're thinking and talking about these works, there is a level of material suspension that also allows you to feel that suspension.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, the work is about fragility and precariousness, and I want there to be that. I want the viewer to have that sense when you're looking at the pieces, not just that it's a representation of that, but that they're the pieces themselves in terms of the materiality are in facts. And in a piece like this, it was about survival. It was stainless steel where the clay was pushed through the stainless steel, extruded, creating all that, that weird shape coming through. There you go. And then it had to survive in the kiln. And stainless makes it through the kiln in a way that copper, which I'm also using, doesn't. So there's a lot of one of the great things about using a material like ceramics that I know nothing about is that there are no rules, and I get to, play and fuck up and make my own rules. So there's a lot of metals being um, And I think we share this in a way. It's like when we have a new material, we kind of rely on our certain things that we're good at. So in like, in this new ceramic work, what I'm good at is using my machines in my studio and sort of, in this case, my two-ton press or um the welders or, and finding a new way into a very traditional form like ceramics or material like ceramics through a material like a process and technique that I've used, you know, for 40 years. So
This is
yeah.
like a particularly interesting moment where it's it's like a human gesture that ends up looking geological. And I think there's like it's it's also fun just to realize that when we use materials, when we use new materials, it is there's a lot of play involved. And I think that's something that I've always admired about your work, that there's a boldness in how you play with materials. But like when we say the things that we're good at, it really is like almost like our habits. Like, what do we habitually do? And what, in a sense, like sometimes when I'm in the studio, my habits, it's just like you're just moving around like a monkey. Like, you're just like doing things and it produces some things that work and some things that don't. And so, like, I can just imagine you like pushing shit through this steel grate. And then all of a sudden realizing actually there's something more here. There's a way to unpack this and a way for that to make sense in the kind of ecology that you're building for the show.
Yes. Yes. I mean, if there's one thing I'm good at, it's play. And I was always, I mean, I play guitar as Min said, in a couple of jam bands and I mean, a couple of garage, whatever, art bands. But the one thing I was always good at, was building worlds, playing with my little, models as a child, or when I learned how to play guitar, sort of jamming and, sort of that idea of improv is super, super important in the work. And I typically, I might make a sketch in my notebook, but it's really all based on play and it's really based on that improvisation. And once I lose that, and I lost it. There was a period from 94 to 2004 where I really did lose my sense of play. And, then that is what I rely on whenever I'm especially trying to develop a new language, which I've done several times now in the work. So yeah, there's a couple of pieces here which I just added in the slideshow that are not in Magenta Plains, but just to give you an idea. But I'm sort of anxious to maybe go back in time and
Yeah.
talk historically about some of the precedents for this new work and some of the through lines that have continued. So yeah. Um, so let's go, Min. Let's go to there we go. 1984, Visions of China. This piece was made for a show at PS1. It was 1 year after my first show at Artist Space. But and it's now in the Guggenheim collection, and it's really sort of, very much based on my interest in Chinese landscape painting. And that was my first sort of like love of diving into landscapes in the work. And so the Scholars rocks are made out of styrofoam. There's a lot of lights and motors happening, making shadows on the screen. Um, Go to
There's
the next slide.
almost like a noir quality to these earlier works too. There's something about it, like even though
Okay.
there's almost a noir quality about these early works. Like
Mm.
even though they're super technicolor, there's something about it that, especially with all the moving shadows, like once you
Uh,
see the person, there's a mystery about it too that feels pulpy and like it's like a pulpy cosmopolitanism.
I love that. Um, well, there is a mystery when you're standing in front of it, and my work has always sort of exposed the mechanism. So the viewer then goes to the side and sees, the sort of the toys and the tchotchkes and the things that are sort of making all that happen. And I added this detail because I talk about in the new work, I talk about, like reinterpreting and giving new meaning to grandma's tchotchkes. And this literally was my grandma's tchotchke. It was a cigarette that I remember going to her home. She lived on West 58th Street, and that would be there would be cigarettes in that little the basket, and then after she died, and her possessions got dispersed among the family, that was something I grabbed and put in this piece. Uh, let's go to the next slide. The Invention of Solitude, the title comes from my brother-in-law, Paul Auster, who I had just met in '85, and I made that sculpture, and I asked him if I could steal the title, which he said yes. And a lot of my titles, I'm not very good at titling my work, so a lot of my titles I'd like to take from, maybe I would consider those found objects too. I take from places that already exist. And so here you see these, this is all motorized and mechanized, and the landscape is constantly changing. Uh, these pieces had digital computers that I was building in 1985, which was sort of pretty wild.
Were you always handy with this stuff? Like, did it just come naturally to you? This is like what you did on your own?
Handy, yeah, I was handy with the engineering part. My brother's an engineer. My dad had a workshop in the basement, and he would repair things, and so I was really quite good with the mechanical part, but I had help with the computer part. And that was in 1985. We literally had to go to Radio Shack and buy all the components and build it ourselves. So it's a miracle these pieces are still working, and they are. Uh,
I mean, what was studio life for you in 1985 making these works? What did it feel like to be displaying works like this that are kind of having a conversation with different parts of the world before it felt like that kind of bleeding was already, sort of naturally happening?
that's interesting. So yeah, 1985. This was the beginning of uh, artists starting to use found sources for sampling. This was, talking heads were listening to, were borrowing African rhythms. Blondie starting to use rap. I mean, there's a lot of cultural appropriation going on, which we didn't really sort of, like I didn't necessarily, I was in love with Chinese landscape painting and Japanese gardens, and this was coming out of affection and love, and it wasn't until later, I would say maybe 10 years later, that I understood the sort of the difficulty of that kind of borrowing. But that was very much a kind of there was a lot of that kind of sampling that was going on in the early 80s. And that's where that work was, coming from. Um, let's go through these, sort of again, sort of like, just the focus on here, the landscape. This is called Taiwan. It's all found objects, furniture that I bought when I did take my first trip to Asia to visit my now wife, Asti, who was in visiting her sister in Taiwan. Um,
I think that's an important part of your work, actually. Like to note that a lot of the things that you see that change over time it's just what was happening in your life. It's how you were experiencing things. So it's not to say, I think sometimes I feel this at least for myself, where there are artists that you can see that they're jumping on some kind of bandwagon about what might be cool or what might be interesting versus seeing how things just play out in their life. And like there's a different kind of richness that comes from just, okay, these are the things that are happening to me. How do I accept that, process that, and then reboot it into sculpture?
That's so astute, Ajay, because yeah, and that's really what the new work is in a way. It's like I'm not the same person that I was, even 10 years ago. And, the new work is reflecting who I am right now, the fragility and the precariousness that I'm feeling, and I'm trying to, have that come out in the work. So yeah, let's keep moving. So we've sort of talked about the landscape, and here's this is definitely sort of this is the piece you saw last year in Maine,
Yeah,
isolated masses now in the collection of the Colby Museum.
huge.
Huge, yeah. I was like, my first show was in 2 years before this, and I just, I was sort of I exploded. 2 years later, it was the work was got enormous, and I was uh, I still didn't even know how to weld. I was making all this work. It's all bolted together, and it was amazing looking at this piece last year when I reinstalled it.
You had
And
mentioned, so you've mentioned the people that you came up with, like Chaim Steinbeck and Ashley Bickerton and Jeff Koons, but like, what about like Ed and Nancy Kienholz? Did they have an influence on you?
definitely, I one of my first real art experiences I remember was seeing one of their installations. I think it was at the Whitney, and it was, one of those very depressed, like brown. The prominent color was brown. It was I think it was a hotel room, and my parents brought me to the Whitney. I saw that, and it was an installation that you walked into, and it rocked me. It was, yeah, loved their work. But that's a different generation, and yes, I was definitely following in the footsteps of certain people who Calder, especially Jean Tingley, Rauschenberg, Lee Bontecu. These are people that sort of have been my touchstones forever, and I don't think about the Keenholz as much as I should, and love their work. Um, let's keep going. Yeah. So again, sort of just like maybe setting the stage for landscape has been in the work for a long time. I just sort of left it behind for a period. So these were pieces that I made. They were the crates themselves. This is in the collection of the Carnegie. And you would just take off the top of the crate, and there'd be the plug, and you'd plug the piece in, and it gathered a kind of uh, signatures of the registrars and the customs stamps, so almost like an old steamer trunk or something, as they moved around from show to show.
This
Um,
is I love this piece, and it actually reminds me of a piece of advice that you gave me when I was working on I was finishing a sculpture for acquisition, and for all the sculptors out there, if you are making something that has a lot of moving parts, John was like sat me down and just said it has to be plug and play. Like it has to be something that you get it, you assemble it, and you plug it in, and everything else should be figured out. And in order to figure things out to that extent, it actually means you have to finish what finishing a sculpture means changed dramatically after you told me that. So thank you for that.
you're so welcome.
But these, yeah, in terms of landscape and in terms of like, this is, I mean, maybe this is the only moment when I have sensed uh almost genuine kind of nostalgia in your work.
Mhm.
Every in most other works, there's like a biting criticism or there's a sense that like things are not okay. And you're revealing all the mechanisms, both metaphorically and then physically within the sculpture. You're always showing how things work. Whereas these, it's like there's more mystery. And I think Min in the next slide, we'll see this in particular, rest in peace, David Lynch. There was something about these works that reminded me of Lynch, and I was wondering if he had an influence on you as well.
No, I mean, when I was moved to New York in 1980, moved to Williamsburg, I was seeing every film he put out, but I would not say that kind of, you know, American surrealism or, was I was thinking more, I was more influenced by Blade Runner, and kind of that more cyberpunk sci-fi.
Gotcha.
Um, but go back one min because it's interesting, Ajay, to just this is very critical. And so essentially what it is a very simple scene. It's a little house on the prairie, but it's not just a blue light, it's actually a television that's underneath the platform. And so it's this random kind of TV light, but here's this beautiful sunset. But it really is about that kind of Guy Debordaian um, separation between representation and real life. And that's what I was sort of after in this piece was the um, the yeah the artificiality of the two lights. One, and of course I'm making the sunset
Right.
with lamps with gels on them. Um, okay. Um, next. Yeah, so the other side, this is a funny piece. I'm not actually showing the other side, but it's a prefab shower that this is one of the few pieces I did at that time without a motor. And it's really a diorama. It's a prefab shower made by Fiat. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see there's a little polar bear that's on the landing. So this was like, I included this because I was also, looking back in my history, and there were animals in peril, animals in compromised situations. So this is nothing new. It's like this. I've been circling these themes for a long time, and
It's
yeah, that,
notable that in this early instance, and I think that we'll get to this kind of larger through line, but that the polar bear finds itself in a completely manufactured landscape that is for the human
right,
versus
right.
the landscape that you start putting them in like the more recent work.
Yeah, that's very true. Um,
Keep going.
yep. So this is my first piece that was directly related to Blade Runner. It's called Bird Runner. And sorry, upside down landscape of New York, upside down photo montage of New York. In the future, all the buildings would be floating and we'd have solved the gravity problem. And then there's a found object, a taxidermy bird, go to the next slide, that's can no longer fly, but taking an elevator up and down, sort of guarding this city. And I did a bunch of Bird Runner pieces. Go to the next one. Um, it's called The Last Bird Runner. Kind of a
I was certain that this was like a reference to something that I didn't know, so I looked up The Last Bird Runner and nothing came up. So what is the deal with Bird Runner? Why like a bird?
well, definitely canary in the coal mine, So like thinking about that kind of who's going to warn us, who's going to like let us know that there's an imbalance going on and we're in trouble. So the bird, and I was just interested in using these taxidermy found objects that I started finding in Paris. And in this case, it's a kind of a geodesic dome, definitely a reference to Bucky Fuller, but some sort of Epcot futurism. But then and you can't tell from a still photo, but on the lower left there's an organ that is playing a very sad song. It's like something I composed, and it's a calliope, and it's all mechanized, and little things coming down and hitting the keys, and yeah. So
It's
that
beautiful to see it running too, because the gears are made of wood. And so there's like longer sections that sort of, that means that the tone goes longer. And
yeah,
just seeing all of that slowly function and seeing the lights change slowly, it's a kind of molasses-inducing experience.
Yeah. And what I didn't expect when I made this piece, because the bird is going up and down, so at a certain point it's playing the melody, but then sorry, then the motor reverses and the song plays in reverse, and it's even more beautiful. And I didn't write it that way. That was, just my kind of my studio engineering moment when I realized, oh my God, Jimmy Page, you just run the tape in reverse and it's even more genius. So, but again, based
I'm not
on,
convinced that David Lynch isn't somehow lingering there.
okay, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. Um, yeah, let's go to the next one. So this might be the last of you know, the historical pieces that I wanted to show. It's called The Outsider, 1999. And This time I really wanted to make a kind of, it's based on the landscape that I made in my studio, a tropical, like jungle, very, very, rainforesty kind of, and it's got the bird moving up and down, but the landscape is on a mechanism. So it's CMYK and it's constantly unregistered. And when the bird gets to the top of its perch, it looks at this landscape for a second, which is all now registered and in perfection, and then the bird starts going back down into the base. Um,
When I see this, it makes it this is very like specifically you. It's a really bizarre sculpture in a good way, but um did you have conversations with Ashley Bickerton? Like was there exchanges of studio visits where things were playing out and like you guys were thinking together, or did it feel like you were all in your separate zones doing your own thing?
he was one of my closest friends. So Ashley, I'm I'm full disclosure here. So typically I in my sort of narrative, I say that I did not show from 1994 to 2004, except here's a piece from 1999. Now, so I got my job at Columbia. I really wasn't working in the studio. I just had sort of lost my mojo. And but at Columbia, if you don't publish, you perish. And I needed to have a show because I was up for review. So I said to my gallery at the time, Luring Augustine, I need a show. And they said, yeah, you can make something and we'll put it in the back room. So I made this piece. And, when I made this piece, I knew it was the end of a way of working. It was like things that I had sort of already done before. I mean, it looks very different in some ways because it's, this very constructed metal structure. And Ashley, who was living in Bali at the time, um, came to New York during the show. And I brought Ashley to see this piece and, really sort of hoping for some approval. And he said, John, you've got to kill your darlings. And I just struggled. I mean, it was a profound thing for, someone you want your friends to be honest with you but sometimes you hate when they are. But I was looking for a way to shift the work and, and have a breakthrough, I suppose. And when he said you've got to kill your darlings, that was, using the burr, that was the mechanical landscape, I don't know, he wasn't really even specific about what those darlings were, and he was leaving it up to me to like, what are the crutches that I'm depending on in the studio, and I've got to kill those. And it's funny because when Ashley died at his memorial, I said, Ashley gave me this great advice that he never really took. I mean, Ashley never really killed his darlings. He kept coming back to them. But it really helped me, but it also threw me into a tailspin. And for years, I didn't show until I came back with the next slide. Oh, sorry, it's not the next slide. I added these two slides because this is also part of the through line. For years, I've made gifts for my family members, for people for their weddings, and and they're small, they're intimate, and so that scale is something I've always been very, very interested in. Like making a piece that literally is a gift that you could give to people. And so when I showed with Salon 94, we did the show, which brought I don't know, 25 gifts together. And it was a very sort of formal exhibition with, as you see, with, the pedestals and the gray stands and so, in some ways, a little bit of um, a prescient, you know, uh, uh, crystal ball of what was to come, later. Um,
I want to continue with the through, like with the what you were talking about
yeah,
regarding
let's
killing
do.
your darlings and then going into this new body of work. So is that, do we have like the installation images
Yeah,
after?
well, let's go to the. So this is the piece that was the successful killing your darlings. And this is a piece I made in 2004, but it was really about 9/11. And again, in using the found object, these are postcards from of the World Trade Center that I put on a mechanism called, that based on a 1 hour photo developing machine. And there's a surveillance camera, and I wanted to replicate the view that the terrorists would have seen in the cockpit, not the view that we were all watching, which was the plane crashing into the building. But, I just couldn't get that image out of my mind, so I decided to make it. And that was the piece I made. And I had no idea what was to follow. But using the surveillance camera and the TV or the video screen really shifted the work. The next image is called Party Crasher. Again, a found object. It's a bosun collectible of a figurine face that I added the hair to. He became my global village idiot, a little bit based on me as an aging hippie. Um, and and everything else fell into place from that. It was like a dam exploded, and the next slide is what came out of it, which is the Palace for 4 a.m., which was my first installation. 6 miles of video cable, 40 mechanisms, hundreds of television screens. It was I call this my apocalypse now. This was my trip up the river, and it was really responding to the hunt for weapons of mass destruction, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, the war in Iraq, Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, just all of everything that was happening then, the politics of the day, the connecting the dots politically.
When I think of, I mean, I'm still thinking about Ashley's phrase, kill your darlings. And to me, in a sense, sometimes artists paint themselves into a corner where there's all the things that made their work vital become exactly the things that calcify it. And in that work, even though I actually really like that work, it's the motor and the timing became perfectly precise, keyed in. You don't see any of the mechanisms, the registration, like everything worked perfectly. And it was things that you knew, you understood, you knew how to manipulate all those things. And when the manipulation becomes so pat, I think that's the moment when it's like, okay, well, this might be the end of something.
Right.
And in order for it to move on, you have to become provisional again.
Absolutely. My friend Robert Longo describes a career like typical artist career as sort of like you start out in a sort of formative, maybe, sort of classical period. And most artists end up in a mannerist,
Yeah.
methodology. Now, not that you can't do great things, look at Caravaggio, like that you can't do great things with mannerism, but the calcification that you're talking about is is something that you really have to be aware of and watch out for. And I've always been yeah, I mean, I've always been in some ways my work has always been a reflection of where I am at the time.
Right.
And so it's I've always been sort of very aware of that. And it comes with a price. I mean, the work, has not been terribly collectible because of my shifts. I'm not a very branded artist, I would say, in terms of, oh, the da-da-da guy, it's like, what's the da-da-da with my work? So, but anyway, it's been an adventure and it's been much more exciting.
Yeah. I mean, this show was, I remember this show very clearly. It was right when I was graduating Columbia, and it was like, I mean, it was a monumental show, and it felt like you were back in a big way.
Oh, thank you, Ajay. I felt back, and it was just pouring out of me in a way that I mean, the new work is also pouring out of me, but from a very different pool of emotions. So this was coming out of rage. This was coming out of really like anger, and that is strong. That can really drive an artist, and the work. And that's where this work was coming out of. And it's hard to sustain that. Um, but, but,
But
um,
you had, I think there was like there was a lot of rage in you because the next couple of shows, like I think the following image is probably the next installation, Min. Yeah, here
yeah.
we go. Kessler's Circus. I felt like Kessler's Circus, Palace at 4 a.m., and then the following the Web. Is
Mm,
it called the Web? All of those are coming from a place of rage, it seems like. And it's just it reminded me of some of Mike Kelly and Paul McCarthy's work. It really goes into a much more specifically sociopolitical space.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the web, yeah, so this is again the reliance on the found object. It's basically hundreds of GI Joes that are being uh, used and abused in this to make that installation about the military industrial complex. Go to the next slide, Min. That's maybe like how we finish up this installation piece, which is the web. Yeah, so in 2013, it was actually based on a Microsoft ad that I saw that was people walking down the street, sort of looking at their phones and not paying attention. And it was just the moment when, handheld devices were becoming, smartphones were really becoming ubiquitous. And somehow the idea of walking down the street, not looking where you were going, looking into your screen and thinking about Guy Debord and the Situationists and that kind of slippage of the real and the you know the manufactured I wanted to make a piece about it. And so this whole piece is literally a mise en abîme about, where is the source and walking through images. It's just image, 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 blue screening. There was a phone app that you downloaded and photos that you took of the installation became part of the installation and they were, proliferating the piece. Go to the next slide. This is actually my Global Village Idiot. I think it's maybe the last time he appeared and this was really based on me, like a body cast. And So thinking about like a Rip Van Winkle kind of character, having slept for, 20 years, waking up and seeing that the world had changed. And now he has to sort of learn how to sext And, you know,
But that's like priority number one.
priority number one, sexting, and, getting in, getting like get with the picture, dude. And so yeah, um, this was the last of the installations. And as I said, I was planning another one, which was going to be about the world, the way the world shifted under Trump in 2016.
It's funny, the one of the things that I notice about where the ideas are and what happens in the work, the most human-centric, the ones that are really about our own myopias, tend to be the most explosively large. And then the works that are kind of about the complexity of the world, the complexity of existence, of our ecosystem, of the precarity of all those things, those shrink down and become very intimate and become moments for a person to pause and have their own understanding of what that larger picture might be. Whereas these human experiences are like things that you walk into and get absorbed into.
No one's ever said that, Ajay. That's why you're doing this interview with me because you're so smart. That's really, really smart. And I never thought of that. Um,
It feels, I mean, there's exceptions to the rule for sure.
yeah,
I feel like those early American the 90s American landscapes in the crates, of course, it plays both ways. But I feel like by and large, when there's something about how you need to digest an idea and explode it, and also maybe the energy that comes with it. You know, when you're in a space when you're processing so many different forms of loss and mourning, you need uh intimacy helps. And I think that that automatically shrinks things down.
it's true. But also, like this as a sculptor, is that your relationship, the body relationship to work is, and the emotions that you want to bring out in the viewer, or you want to elicit in the viewer are very scale based. And, it's like there's there's a reason why we have the senses that we do when we're standing in front of a Giacometti. Giacometti is not a monumental sculptor. Giacometti's pieces were really sort of, I think they were quite intimate, and human scaled. And then especially when he would take those, the figures, and especially the sort of, maybe these are landscape sculptures. I never really thought of that, but like, the plateau or the terrace with, the several figures sort of walking in opposite directions, that's sort of like you feel that existential loneliness, and in the scale is very important for the viewer. Um,
Yeah.
can we go to the next two slides, this is the 2017 biennial that I was in with Ajay. Um, and these are the two pieces that's, sort of got me thinking about climate change and about ecological collapse. And this piece also got me back onto eBay looking for tchotchkes. So it was kind of very important. So all of those figurines are figurines that are bought on eBay, and all, sort of like travelers or migrants or people carrying their belongings, and the whole piece is built on a steamer trunk. There's an iPhone um, that's surveilling them, and then it gets very wonky with a video feedback that's happening in the screen. And then the next work, which is the last slide I have, which is Evolution, which the Whitney bought. And and again, this is sort of like the other side of the coin, which is not people having to leave their homes because of climate change, but evolving because of, sort of mitigating the disasters and figuring out ways to build higher, levees and seawalls. And, this was a crazy piece. And I don't, I'm sort of like, I'm dreading the day when Scott Rothkopf calls me and says, we're installing that piece. And I finished it at the Whitney. Maybe you remember that. I
Yeah.
drilled through my finger and finished that piece. Chris and Mia were so sweet. They were like, we never let anyone do this, but we're going to let you go and work on it. It was like literally moments before people walked in. And so I have to remember how to put that piece back together. Um,
That'll
and
be
that,
fun, I'm sure.
yeah.
I mean, it also dovetails so nicely with that broken iPad in the show at Magenta Plains. Like it's seeing screens as water in
Mhm.
2017 and how that's coming back on a new scale in a new way with no humans present really. And they become these kind of peaceful, almost, like Ikebana displays
Yeah.
of how to understand what our next step is. So there's something a little more wry and cynical here, whereas I think the works that are in your current show are, they're coming from a place of we've been beat the fuck up so many times. It's just like we need a little space for tenderness. And it's not to say that the works aren't don't have pathos or don't have so many other things, but tenderness is something that I think might often get relegated to the place of unseriousness. And it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And just to finish out if there's anyone that's sort of wondering, I mentioned that installation I was going to do about Trump, and really what happened was as I started working on that piece and the world became so toxic, I started to need something very different from my work and from what I was experiencing in the studio, and I really did need to close that out and not bring that toxicity inside. And so the work started to shift at that point and become much more um, yeah, I mean, it definitely has that pathos, but I'm relying on a lot of the chops that I sort of developed early on, which were my own sense of aesthetics, and a lot of those come from, like learning Ikebana and flower arranging and certain ideas of dynamic equilibrium, and I mean, so it's just a lot of I mean, I'm working alone now. I don't have any assistants, and the work feels, I want the work to feel very intimate, and that it was, sort of, it's coming from a place of tenderness, and as you say, and affection.
I feel it. I think that's a great place to stop and maybe I'll pass it over to Magli and Min and Chloe to round up questions.
Thank you, Ajay and John. Our first question is from GE. Um, Oh, by the way, please feel free to submit your questions. There's a form in the chat. You can send your questions there and I can read it, or you can ask yourself. First question is from GE. How do you balance between the desire or the need to master the kinetic qualities of things and allowing the kinetics to have their way?
Min, you cut out, there were a few words here, so just repeat the question.
Thanks. How do you balance between the desire or the need to master the kinetic qualities of things and allowing the kinetics to have their way?
Um, Allow the kinetics to have their way. I'm not sure well, I mean, I'm not sure this is really answering G's question, but kinetic art. Someone once said this, and it kind of rocked me, through me, and I say this to my students when they come to me and say, "Hey, I want to make a kinetic artwork," And so you're like in the country and look out in the field and there's this piece of old rusty farm equipment and you use your imagination and you think about all the things it might do or if it moved or it kind of looks like a big monster and blah blah. And then you see it moving and it's boring as fuck, and it's just like it's just doing its, mechanical thing. So kinetic art runs that risk, and so it's very important to try to find a way to, like give it life, and I've sort of learned over the years that I'm interested when I make a work of kinetic art that, I mean, not, balancing is different, but especially when you start adding motors to work, you want to give it uh, a sense that it has not just a jankiness, but a life, like maybe a subjectivity in some ways. And that's, takes a little bit more skill to do that than just make something that just spins around. But that's what I try to do.
Thank you, John. Our next question is from me, and I know you've taught at Columbia for years. How has your work as a teacher impacted the way you think about your practice, or has it?
Yes. So, you know, um, one of the things that has been a blessing is teaching at Columbia, being in studios, giving students a window into what hopefully is a very, very long journey. And, you know, teaching them the questions to ask themselves and, and how to continually challenge themselves. And, and that really helped me during a time where I was not really able to do that myself. And so, I did have a bit of imposter syndrome during that period, but at the same time, it sort of, kept me in the game, so to speak, and seeing what they were grappling with and, reflecting it back on what I was grappling with and the other thing, and like New York professors don't necessarily get the cred that whenever people talk about art professors, they always talk about California. I don't know why, Michael Asher and John Baldessari and right, Ajay, do you feel that? That's like, come on, give New York some love, Um,
Probably.
and right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go on. I'm curious to hear this thought.
No, and I think that, there's brilliant teachers on the East Coast and so many, artists that I know, not just my network of Columbia grads, but, people who study with people at Yale and people who study with people at Hunter and Rutgers and SVA and there's just some brilliant educators out there, and thanks to all of them.
John was a great teacher. He was actually one of my favorites at Columbia. He just there was a lot of people that, kind of hoard knowledge, and John was just always very free with it. And you could tell that he was coming from an artist perspective, but he knew how to be there for young artists in ways that felt like incredibly hospitable. And yeah, so when you see like when John was in the 2017 biennial, there were many of his students in that biennial, and like the all the people that he's mentored and taught, it's a vast group of artists that we all hold a special place for John. So it's good when you have educators like that. They're influencing generations, and whether or not it gets like codified in some way, it's very real.
Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, there's a great photo that I love looking at. It's you, Tommy Hartung, Dana Schutz, Kirsten Brach, Jeremy Eilers, Noah Fisher, Samara Golden.
Eliza Niesenbaum.
Lisa, well, she wasn't my student. She was teaching there at the time,
Oh,
though.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, yeah.
All right. Our last question is from Phong.
I've been trying. Congratulations, John. Thank you, Ajay. I've been trying to get John to quit teaching for so long. Um,
Give
but
me a job,
listen,
Tom.
well, listen, you created the most important, popular, beloved program in the country. You train and support so many people. Somebody has to fulfill that civic duty, you know. But listen, it's amazing that you're able to keep up the work. And congratulations on the recent show. I popped in the tail end last Friday quickly, but I have to come back and look with much closer time span and meditating on the work. And I know I did it once, pay a visit during the pandemic, and I'm just happy that this body of work get shown at the gallery now. You know, it's a wonderful gallery. I like what they've been doing. So congratulations, Manhattan Plains. So my question is this, John. I was talking to Weiwei the other day when he came for an interview. We were talking about how during the Cultural Revolution, Mao would go to Khrushchev for support from Russia. So in those days, Russia was a big brother and China was small brother. Now it's reversed. Now Putin comes to, Xi Jinping for support. And it just makes me think about the prominent rise of China in geopolitical, landscape. And I just can't help think about your own interest in China, in Chinese landscape. And I just want to specifically ask the question, when did that worldview materialize? Because, it's a very specific kind. It just it's just so intensely different from the way that the Western artists look at nature. The Chinese artists in the East, they look at nature without any emphasis of individual element being more important than other. Everything is being, treated with the same worth,
Mm.
equal worth. So I just want to ask you about that because I feel about the work now that is in your work.
Wow. Um, so yeah, I mean, it was it for me the real affection and love is for late Song Dynasty landscapes. I mean, those to me are the high point of, that kind of um the 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 non-perspective, the
Mhm.
sort of endless, storytelling that's going on as you sort of like your eye moves around the scroll um and the balance. It's like it's somehow this sort of like world in balance, which is, made of confusion. And I feel in some ways that's what I'm trying to do right now, just trying to put, sort of this world back together, at least, my sculpture, to put all of these disparate elements that are quite, yeah. I mean, I think of it as like a wonder, if a wonder comma was turned into a Rubik's cube, so you
Oh.
have that the craziness of a wonder comma, but then all of a sudden it's given, sort of organization. And that's directly what I learned from, that late song uh, period. So,
Yeah, I was thinking, thank you. You just brought up the word confusion is actually very close to Confucius. Some people might even say that. They even say Confucius confuses us, But no, the treatment of overall form and whatnot. And then the certain aspect of erosion of form, which I'm interested.
Mhm.
Work from the casting bit here and there, that you turn that kind of distortion in a way into the work. And it made me think about, the environment, which with so much of the central focus of the work right now.
Mhm.
As you know, China had been buying metal from the US, scrap metals particularly, because they build in bridges and building and cement. So those are two things they. So I wonder how much are you aware or even pay attention to economic war that's going on now in the current, political climax, whether it's implicated in the work somehow.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, thank you for bringing it up. It's not something I'm necessarily thinking about. The sort of like, the global shifting of trade. So, I mean, boy, that's in the news right now too. Uh,
Yeah.
but it was interesting. I mean, just like for living in New York, and all of a sudden, it's like you'd see. I mean, I do shop at scrap yards, so all of a sudden, when the Chinese were buying, all the metal, they wouldn't even allow they didn't even let me in anymore. It was sort of like, we don't need you, to come
Okay.
selling everything we have to the Chinese. And then think about, I mean, it's interesting. Think about plastics. We were recycling plastics because they were getting sent to China, and that stopped happening. So
Yeah.
like, so there's, it's. I mean, it's just gonna be fascinating. What like, where
Mm.
we're gonna be, and it seems like things are moving so quickly. So
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
but I just did. Um, I I just did an installation. This was pretty wild. It's the Blue Period, which I did not show today. It's
Yeah.
uh, it's an installation that is at Zaha Hadid's last project. I think it's in oh God, what's the it's in Hunan somewhere, and I don't know. I don't know the town, but we did it on Zoom. It was
Hmm.
wild,
Yeah.
to do this very complicated installation, like on Zoom. And
Yeah.
yeah, um, but the work has been, I've been showing in China the last couple of years, but not, it's interesting. And this was also happening in Japan. They were not so interested in the Asian inspired pieces, even the pieces about Ikebana.
Hmm. Hmm.
I worked
Yeah.
with I worked with the Sogetsu Ikebana school, and I made a whole series with Sofu Teshigahara's Ikebana displays, and they were never shown in Japan. And maybe that was just not, you know, that just they wanted to. They were much more interested in seeing some sort of more Americanized,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
I mean, I don't know. I
Well,
don't.
that makes sense because
Yeah.
Japan after the end of the Second War was burning to ashes, so they had to do something in response fairly quickly. One
Mhm.
is to promise their people that they would have lifetime job as an incentivized um, commitment, and the other is really adopt American free market economy as quickly they can. By 67, I think they became the second most powerful economic power in the world, only behind America.
Yeah.
So of course they're not going to be interested looking back, but that's the difference between Zen Buddhism and Confucian Buddhism in mainland China. Go, you can go up in a mountain and contemplate, and you can lose yourself in nature, in the spectacle of nature, the sublimity of nature. But if you do that in Japan, you go up there and tons of people already picnicking, you know? So the
Yeah.
nature had to be within, not without. But it has so much element of what I've been thinking of. But I got to go back and look closely, John. So forgive me for asking way too soon. But congratulations again. Thank you, Ajay. And yeah, maybe we'll meet there, hopefully soon.
And listen, Fong, I just want to say thank you to you because you were an early supporter of this work. You came into my studio a couple of years ago, and I remember you got the guy from Karma on the. You literally just FaceTimed him and said, "Look at this work," and and thank you because that whenever you're developing a new body of work, the first, the beginning of it is really tenuous and you're
Yes.
feeling your way through the dark and you don't know if it's good or not and you just have to believe in yourself and that was a very um affirming visit with you, so thank you.
Well, the show at MoMA PS1 established that believability for life. So the pantheon is open wide. Thank you, John. Thank you,
Thank you.
Ajay. Back to you.
Thank you, Fong. We're going to close off our conversation today with Ajay's reading.
Okay. I am going to read from Paul Chan's essay, Second Nature. This is at the very tail end of it. I'm not going to give too much context, but I will say that the essay really starts with him talking about Odysseus and the word cunning um, and what that means. Purity, legitimacy, harmony. These notions are being deployed aesthetically to play to the hearts and minds of listeners because they evoke an image of what the good life is supposed to be. This appeal to the good life is how the arguments aesthetically justify the xenophobia. It is how hating and fearing immigrants become acceptable, reasonable. And the greater affective power of the appeal, the more political cover it provides. It is as if the more beautiful an image is, the more willing one is to sacrifice oneself and others to partake in what the image promises. What if it is possible to strengthen one's capacity to identify compositional patterns that make an argument or any other form of expression more likely to be accepted as reasonable? What if this possibility enables one to be vigilant about the power of aesthetic persuasion without diminishing one's appreciation for how that power also brings forth pleasure, delight, and other festive aspects of life that make it worth living? What if art is at the core of this possibility? What if it is shown that art is unique in how it is emblematic of polytropism, or the notion that reason is dialectically related to cunning? And what if, within this framework, it is argued that the experience of art makes us more polytropic, or more vigilant in evaluating reason, and more inventive and compelling in producing forms of reasoning? And if it is still the case that reason is how a public finds its shape and direction, what if it is argued that polytropism is the key to the strength and vitality of public discourse in general? And what if this way of understanding art changes the roles of institutions like museums play? The role institutions like museums play. What if the institutional framework of art shifts from one where it is considered and valued primarily as a form of expression or a container for meanings or an exemplar of artistic, historical, economic, or cultural authority to one where it is appreciated, criticized, and comprehended as an act of wild reason or a proposition about what is worth making real? And what if this shift fosters reflection about the polytropic dimension of art as a semblance of the work's aesthetic quality? What if this kind of reflection enables us to experience the persuasive power of aesthetics without fear or harm? And what if this experience helps us grasp how aesthetics is deployed in ways that we may recognize, take pleasure in, and be vigilant of in the great expanse that is our social reality? What if, by following this line of thinking, we find there is more to us than we once imagined, and we begin to see and make choices where none are evident or given? It is then that I think a remarkable idea becomes available, that art, being more than simply what it is, can give us something rarer than beauty or meaning or piles of money. It can offer a kind of enlivening that deepens our capacity to endure and delight in what the day demands. This deepening has a historical name. It is called second nature.
Amen. When did he write that?
That was written, I don't know. It was in October at some point, October magazine, and I'm not sure when. I'm sorry. But I've used it a lot in teaching, and it just felt really appropriate in how you think about your work and pleasure and cunning and the ways that you critique. And yeah, it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, John. So thanks for everything that you do, and thanks for this new show, and thanks to everybody who showed up.
Thank you, Ajay. Thanks all. Thanks for coming.
Oh, and thanks to the Brooklyn Rail.
Thank you, Brooklyn Rail.
Thank you, John and Ajay. Thanks to the team at Magenta Plains for their support in preparing for today's event as well. We'd like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Jason Stopa and Gabby Collins Fernandez on the event of Interior Monument at Seville Dolmaci. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Fantastic
you.
conversation.
Thank you, Ajay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
That was an
Thank you,
amazing
John.
briefing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Need to go see the show.
Congratulations, John.
Yeah, go see the show, everybody.
Definitely go see the show.
Yeah,
Thank you so
definitely.
much.
It just opened, so be there for a while.
Bye, everybody. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you, John.
Thank
Thank you,
you all.
AJ.
All right, thank you.
Have a good